The dust hung in the air like a curtain of gold as the afternoon sun beat down on the town of Redemption Springs. It was the kind of heat that made everything shimmer, that made the wooden buildings look like they might melt into the red earth beneath them. Margaret Sullivan stood behind the counter of her father's general store, her flour-dusted hands folding burlap sacks with the kind of precision that came from years of practice. At 26 years old, she had long since accepted that this counter, these shelves, these same faces coming through the door day after day, would be her entire world. She was not what the town considered beautiful. Her frame was substantial, her face round and plain, her hands thick from work. The other young women in Redemption Springs had married years ago, their waists cinched tight in fashionable dresses, their laughter floating through the streets like music. Margaret had stopped attending the dances 3 years back, tired of standing against the wall while the fiddles played, tired of the pitying glances from the married women, tired of her own mother's barely concealed disappointment. Her father, Henry Sullivan, had built the general store from nothing when he first came to this territory 20 years ago. He was a good man, worn down by the loss of his wife to fever 5 winters past, but still kind in his weathered way. He never spoke of Margaret's unmarried state, never pushed her toward suitors, but she could see the worry in his eyes when he thought she wasn't looking. What would become of her when he was gone? A woman alone in the West was a precarious thing, dependent on the charity of relatives or the uncertain work that few would offer. The bell above the door chimed, and Margaret looked up from her work. 3 women entered, their voices already raised in animated conversation. She recognized them immediately. Sarah Whitmore, the banker's wife, with her perfect blonde curls and expensive silk dress from San Francisco. Jessica Crawford, married to the town's most successful cattle broker, her sharp features arranged in an expression of perpetual judgment. And young Abigail Porter, newly wed to the deputy, still glowing with the triumph of her recent marriage. They moved through the store like a flock of well-dressed birds, picking up items and setting them down, their conversation continuing as if Margaret were merely another fixture of the room, no more noteworthy than the barrels of flour or the hanging lanterns. "Did you hear about the advertisement?" Sarah was saying, her voice carrying easily across the store, posted right there on the community board. "A rancher looking for a wife." Jessica laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Oh, I saw it. Some desperate man up in the hill country, probably ancient and poor, looking for free labor more than a companion. The advertisement said he owns 3,000 acres. Abigail added, her young voice uncertain, as if she wasn't quite sure she should be part of this conversation but couldn't resist the gossip. "That's not nothing." Sarah waved her hand dismissively. "Land means little if you can't work it profitably. Besides, what kind of man advertises for a wife? It's unseemly. Any decent man would court properly." Margaret continued folding the burlap sacks, her movements steady, her face carefully neutral. She had learned long ago to make herself invisible during such conversations, to let the words wash over her without reaction. "I wonder who would respond to such a thing," Jessica said, moving closer to the counter with a tin of peaches. "A woman would have to be truly desperate. Desperate or damaged." Sarah agreed. No woman of quality would need to answer an advertisement. Margaret took the tin from Jessica, wrapped it in brown paper, and recorded the purchase in the ledger. Her father insisted on keeping accounts for the prominent families, allowing them to settle their bills monthly. Margaret had her own opinions about extending such credit, but she kept them to herself. As the women continued their gossip, moving on to other topics, other targets for their sharp tongues, Margaret found her mind drifting to the advertisement they had mentioned. She had seen it that morning when she swept the boardwalk in front of the store. The paper had been crisp and new, the handwriting careful and clear. "Rancher seeks wife. Own 3,000 acres in the hill country. Honest work, simple life. Seeking a woman of good character, strength, and kindness. Age and appearance unimportant. Please respond to Thomas Brennan, care of the post office, Cedar Ridge." She had read it 3 times before her father called her back inside, and even now, hours later, she could recall every word. Age and appearance unimportant. Those words had struck something deep inside her, something she thought had died years ago. Not hope, exactly. Hope was too dangerous, but perhaps curiosity, perhaps the smallest ember of possibility. The women finally completed their purchases and swept out of the store in a cloud of perfume and self-satisfaction, leaving Margaret alone with the silence and the dust motes dancing in the afternoon light. She stood very still for a moment, her hands resting on the worn wood of the counter, feeling the weight of all her years pressing down on her shoulders. That evening, after the store closed and her father retired to his room above the shop, Margaret sat at the small desk in the corner of the stockroom. She pulled out a sheet of writing paper, one of the good ones they sold for 15 cents, and dipped her pen in ink. For a long time she simply sat there, the pen hovering above the blank page, while the oil lamp flickered and cast dancing shadows on the walls. What did she have to lose? Pride. She had surrendered that years ago, piece by piece, with each pitying glance and whispered comment. Security. She had none to speak of beyond her father's dwindling health and the uncertain future of the store. Dignity. She had been folding burlap sacks and listening to women like Sarah Whitmore for so long that she had almost forgotten what dignity felt like. She began to write, her hand steady despite the trembling in her chest. She did not lie about herself, did not paint a picture of beauty or grace that did not exist. Instead, she wrote about the store, about her father, about her ability to keep accounts and manage inventory. She wrote about her strength, the physical kind that came from lifting crates and barrels, from years of hard work. She wrote about the loneliness of watching life happen to everyone else while she stood still, behind a counter, measuring out sugar and flour for other people's lives. When she finished, she read the letter 3 times, each time fighting the urge to tear it up and throw it in the stove. But something stopped her. Perhaps it was the memory of those words, age and appearance unimportant. Perhaps it was the desperate, aching need to be seen as something more than the fat girl behind the counter, more than the unmarriageable daughter, more than a cautionary tale whispered about at church socials. She sealed the letter before she could change her mind and hid it in her apron pocket. Tomorrow, she would walk to the post office when her father took his afternoon rest. Tomorrow she would do something that terrified her. Tomorrow, she would reach for the smallest possibility that someone, somewhere, might want her. The weeks that followed were a special kind of torture. Margaret went about her daily work with the letter sitting like a stone in her chest, both hoping for a reply and dreading it in equal measure. She told herself that the rancher had probably received dozens of responses, that a man with 3,000 acres would have his pick of women, that her letter was likely sitting in a pile of others unread and unremarkable. She told no one about what she had done. Not her father, not the few acquaintances she had in town, certainly not the gossiping women who frequented the store. It was her secret, her small act of rebellion against the life that had been decided for her. 6 weeks after she mailed the letter, on a Thursday morning when the autumn wind was just beginning to carry the first hint of coming winter, a man walked into the Sullivan General Store. Margaret looked up from the inventory she was taking and found herself staring at someone who seemed to have been carved from the landscape itself. He was tall, probably in his early 40s, with dark hair streaked with silver at the temples and eyes the color of creek water in shadow. His face was weathered by sun and wind, lined with the marks of a hard life lived outdoors. He wore simple clothes, clean but worn, and he carried himself with a quiet dignity that had nothing to do with wealth or status and everything to do with knowing exactly who he was. "Miss Sullivan?" he asked, his voice low and careful. Margaret's heart stopped, then started again with a painful lurch. "Yes, I'm Thomas Brennan. I received your letter." The world seemed to tilt sideways. Margaret gripped the edge of the counter, her knuckles white. Of all the scenarios she had imagined, she had never truly believed he would come here, to Redemption Springs, to find her in person. "I don't mean to intrude," he continued when she didn't speak, "but I thought it important to meet face to face, to talk honestly before any decisions are made. I'm staying at the boarding house for a few days. Perhaps we could speak somewhere proper with a chaperone if you prefer." Margaret found her voice, though it came out smaller than she intended. "My father. We could talk here, with my father present." Thomas nodded, something that might have been relief crossing his features. "That would be appropriate. When would suit?" "This evening. After supper, 6 o'clock. I'll be here." He left as quietly as he had come, and Margaret stood frozen behind the counter, her mind reeling. He had come? This man, this rancher with 3,000 acres and a careful, honest face, had traveled days to meet her. He had not taken one look at her substantial frame and plain face and walked back out the door. He had asked to talk, to meet properly with respect and propriety. That evening, Margaret put on her best dress, though best was a relative term. It was clean and pressed, dark blue calico that her mother had made 5 years ago, let out twice since then to accommodate Margaret's form. She brushed her dark hair until it shone and pinned it back carefully. She did not look beautiful. She had never looked beautiful. But she looked neat and respectable, and that would have to be enough. Her father, when she told him about the expected visitor, had looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Surprise, certainly, and perhaps concern, but also something that might have been hope. He asked no questions, simply nodded and put on his Sunday shirt. Thomas Brennan arrived exactly at 6 o'clock. Margaret's father invited him to sit at the small table in the room behind the store where they took their meals. Margaret made coffee, her hands surprisingly steady as she poured 3 cups and set out the apple cake she had baked that afternoon. For a long moment, the three of them simply sat, the silence broken only by the ticking of the clock on the wall and the distant sounds of the town settling into evening. It was Thomas who finally spoke. "Mr. Sullivan, I want to be honest with you and your daughter. I'm not a young man anymore. I'm 43 years old. I've been alone for 10 years, since my wife died bringing our son into the world. The boy lived 3 days. He paused, his hands wrapped around the coffee cup, his eyes distant with old pain. I tried to work the ranch alone, told myself I didn't need anyone, didn't want to risk that kind of loss again. But land is lonely company, and I've come to understand that a life without companionship isn't much of a life at all." Henry Sullivan nodded slowly. "That's honest speaking, Mr. Brennan. I appreciate it. I own 3,000 acres, like the advertisement said. It's good land mostly, though the work is hard and constant. The house is solid, built of stone, but it's plain. No luxuries, no fancy things. I have 30 head of cattle, good breeding stock, and I've been building the herd slowly. I make enough to live comfortably, to save a bit, but I'll never be a rich man. What I'm offering is a simple life, hard work, and honest partnership." He turned to Margaret then, meeting her eyes directly. "Miss Sullivan, I received 14 responses to my advertisement. Most of them were from young women looking for adventure or escape, written in careless hands with romantic notions. Yours was different. You wrote about duty and work, about loyalty and practicality. You didn't promise to love me. You didn't claim to be something you're not. You wrote like a woman who understands what life requires." Margaret felt heat rising to her face, but she forced herself to hold his gaze. "Mr. Brennan, I won't lie to you either. I'm 26 years old, and I'm not what anyone would call a catch. I'm fat, I'm plain, and I've spent my whole life being overlooked. I answered your advertisement because it's probably the only chance I'll ever have at a different life." That's not romantic, but it's honest. Something shifted in Thomas's expression, a softening around his eyes. "Miss Sullivan, I don't need a beauty. I've known beautiful people with empty hearts. I need a partner, someone strong enough for the life I'm offering. Your letter told me you could be that person, but I needed to meet you to be sure, to see if we could talk honest to each other, if we could build something real on solid ground instead of pretty lies. And," Margaret's voice was barely above a whisper, "and I think we could, if you're willing." Henry Sullivan cleared his throat. "This is all very sudden. Margaret, you don't have to decide tonight. Mr. Brennan, I appreciate you coming here meeting proper, but my daughter needs time to think." "Of course." Thomas agreed immediately. "I'm staying in town for 3 days. Miss Sullivan, perhaps we could talk again tomorrow. Take a walk, talk more about what this life would be like. I want you to have every chance to decide if this is truly what you want." Over the next 3 days, Margaret and Thomas Brennan walked the dusty streets of Redemption Springs, talking with the careful honesty of 2 people who had both been hurt by life and were trying to build something real from the wreckage. He told her about his ranch, about the creek that ran through the eastern pasture, about the stand of cottonwoods near the house where birds nested in spring. He told her about the isolation, the long winters, the constant work that ranching demanded. She told him about the store, about her mother's death, about the loneliness of watching everyone else's life move forward while hers stood still. She told him about her strength, her ability to work hard, her head for numbers and management. She did not tell him about the whispered comments, the pitying glances, the slow death of hope. She didn't need to. He seemed to understand anyway. On the 3rd day, as they sat on a bench outside the store watching the sun set behind the distant hills, Thomas turned to her with a question in his eyes. "Miss Sullivan, Margaret, I know this isn't a love match. Maybe it never will be. But I think we could build something good together, something based on respect and partnership. I think we could be kind to each other, work beside each other, make a life that matters. Would you be willing to try?" Margaret looked at him, this weathered man with honest eyes and careful words, and felt something loosen in her chest. Not love, not yet, but possibility. The chance to be more than the fat girl behind the counter, more than the unmarriageable daughter. The chance to work land that belonged to her too, to build something with her own hands, to be a partner instead of a burden. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, I would." They were married 3 weeks later in a small ceremony at the church, with Margaret's father and the preacher as witnesses. Sarah Whitmore and her circle of friends attended, their faces tight with disapproval and barely concealed shock. Margaret wore the same dark blue dress she had worn that first evening, and Thomas wore his Sunday suit. They spoke their vows clearly and honestly, promising to be faithful and true, to work together and stand together through whatever came. After the ceremony, as they prepared to leave for the hill country, Margaret's father pulled her aside. His eyes were wet, and his voice shook slightly as he spoke. "Your mother would be proud of you, girl. You're braver than you know. Go make a good life." Margaret hugged him tightly, breathing in the familiar smell of tobacco and soap, wondering if she would ever see him again. "I'll write every week," she promised. "And you're welcome at the ranch anytime. It will be your home, too." The journey to Thomas's ranch took 2 days by wagon. They traveled through country that grew wilder and more beautiful with each mile, leaving behind the settled farmland around Redemption Springs and climbing into territory where pines grew thick and the air smelled of sage and snow. They talked easily, the conversation flowing naturally now that the decision was made, now that they were committed to this path together. Thomas told her about his childhood in Missouri, about coming west as a young man seeking fortune and finding hard work instead. She told him about growing up in the store, about learning to read from the newspapers that came through, about the books she had secretly borrowed from the lending library and read by candlelight after the store closed. On the second evening, as they made camp beside a small stream, Thomas looked at her across the fire and said quietly, "I want you to know that I meant what I said about partnership. This will be your ranch too, Margaret. Your home, your land. I'm not looking for a servant or a housekeeper. I'm looking for someone to build a life with." Margaret felt tears sting her eyes, unexpected and unwelcome. She blinked them back and nodded. "I'll work hard. I'll be a good partner. I promise you that." "I know you will," he said simply. The ranch, when they finally arrived, was more beautiful than Margaret had imagined. The house sat in a small valley surrounded by rolling hills dotted with pine and cedar. The structure was solid, built of gray stone with a wide porch that looked out over the land. It wasn't large or fancy, but it had been built to last, to shelter the people inside from whatever the country threw at them. Thomas helped her down from the wagon, and for a moment they stood together, looking at the house and the land spreading out in all directions. Margaret felt something shift inside her, something she couldn't quite name. It wasn't happiness, exactly. It was too big for that, too raw. It was the feeling of standing at the beginning of something, of having the chance to create a life instead of just surviving one. The first months were hard in ways Margaret hadn't anticipated. The work was constant and physical, from dawn until well past dark. She learned to milk cows and gather eggs, to churn butter and smoke meat. She learned to help Thomas with the cattle, to ride a horse despite her size, to mend fences and haul water. Her body, which had always been a source of shame in Redemption Springs, became an asset here. Her strength, her ability to lift and carry and endure, was not something to hide but something to use. Thomas was patient with her learning, never mocking her mistakes, always willing to show her again how to do something properly. He was quiet by nature, comfortable with long silences, but when he spoke it was usually something worth hearing. They fell into a rhythm, a partnership of work and shared purpose. At night, they sat by the fire, sometimes talking, sometimes reading from the small collection of books Thomas owned, sometimes simply existing in the same space without need for words. He was gentle with her in ways she hadn't expected, respectful of her space and her person. Their marriage was chaste, by unspoken agreement, and Margaret was grateful for it. This was enough, this partnership, this building of something together. Anything more could come later, if it came at all. Winter settled over the hill country like a blanket, deep and cold and beautiful. Snow covered the land, and the work became focused on survival, on keeping the animals fed and the house warm. Margaret had never experienced such isolation, For weeks, they might not see another human being, might not hear any voice but their own. She had expected it to be lonely, but instead she found it freeing. Here, there was no one to judge her, no one to whisper about her appearance or her unmarried state. Here, she was simply Margaret Brennan, rancher, partner, woman with work to do and a life to live. One evening in late January, as they sat by the fire after supper, Thomas looked up from the harness he was mending and said, "You're good at the books, the accounting. I've been doing it my own way, but it's not very organized. Would you be willing to take that over? Keep track of everything proper?" Margaret looked up from her knitting, surprised. "You trust me with that?" "Of course. Why wouldn't I?" He seemed genuinely puzzled by her question. Most men wouldn't. Thomas set down the harness and looked at her seriously. "Margaret, I meant what I said. This is your ranch, too. Every decision we make together. Every dollar we earn together. I don't want a wife who just obeys. I want a partner who thinks and plans and helps me build something that lasts." Margaret felt that sting of tears again, that unexpected emotion that sometimes caught her off guard. In the months since their marriage, Thomas had never once made her feel less than him, never once treated her as anything but an equal. It was a gift she hadn't known to hope for. "Yes," she said quietly. "I'll keep the books, over the following weeks." Margaret threw herself into organizing the ranch's finances. She discovered that Thomas had been undercharging for his cattle, not keeping proper track of expenses, operating on instinct rather than careful planning. She created ledgers, established a system, found ways to cut costs and increase efficiency. When she presented her findings to Thomas, he listened carefully, nodded, and implemented every suggestion she made. "You're good at this," he said, genuine admiration in his voice. "Better than me. I've been fumbling along, doing things the way I've always done them. You see patterns I don't." Margaret felt pride bloom in her chest, a feeling she hadn't experienced in years. Here on this isolated ranch in the hill country, she was valuable. Not despite her differences, but because of them. Her practical mind, her careful attention to detail, her strength and endurance, all the things that had made her unmarriageable in Redemption Springs made her essential here. Spring came slowly, the snow melting to reveal brown grass that gradually greened as the days grew longer. The cattle grew sleek and healthy, and when it came time to drive a small herd to market, Thomas asked Margaret to ride with him. They spent 4 days on the trail, working together to move the cattle through rough country, and Margaret felt herself becoming someone new. Someone capable and competent, someone who mattered. At the market, the cattle broker tried to lowball them on price. Thomas started to accept, but Margaret stepped forward, her ledger in hand, and calmly explained exactly what their animals were worth based on current market rates, feed costs, and the quality of their stock. The broker, surprised to be negotiating with a woman, tried to dismiss her, but Margaret stood her ground. In the end, they got their full price, plus a premium for the exceptional condition of the animals. As they rode home with gold in their pockets, Thomas looked at her with something that might have been wonder. "Where did you learn to do that?" "Years behind a counter, watching my father negotiate with suppliers. Years of being invisible, which meant people talked business in front of me like I wasn't there. I learned a lot just by listening and watching." Thomas laughed, a rare sound that transformed his weathered face. "Best decision I ever made, putting that advertisement up." Something warm unfurled in Margaret's chest at those words. Not love, not yet, but something that might become love if given enough time and care. That summer, they worked from dawn to dusk, expanding the herd, improving the fences, building a new barn. Margaret's body grew even stronger, her skin bronzed by the sun, her hands calloused but capable. She learned to read the weather, to predict when storms would come, to know what the cattle needed just by watching them. She became part of the land in a way she had never been part of Redemption Springs. In late July, they received a letter from Margaret's father. Business was failing, the big mercantile from the city had opened a branch in town, and he couldn't compete. He was thinking of selling, of moving to live with his sister in Kansas. Margaret read the letter 3 times, feeling the weight of her father's defeat in every line. "We should bring him here," Thomas said when she told him. "There's room, and we could use an extra pair of hands. He could help with the ranch work, or just rest if that's what he needs. This is his home too if he wants it." Margaret looked at her husband. This quiet man who had given her a life and was now offering to give her father one too, and felt something shift inside her, something final and complete. It wasn't the romantic love she had read about in books. It was something better, deeper, more solid. It was partnership and respect and kindness day after day, building something real together. Yes, she said. Let's bring him here. Henry Sullivan arrived in September, thinner than Margaret remembered, worn down by failure and grief. But as the weeks passed, as he found work to do and purpose in helping them build the ranch, he began to recover. He was good with animals, gentle and patient, and he took over the care of the chickens and the milk cows with quiet competence. At night, the three of them sat together on the porch, watching the sun set over the hills, and Margaret felt something she had never expected to feel. She felt like she belonged. One evening in late October, as the air turned crisp and the leaves began to change, Thomas and Margaret sat alone on the porch after her father had gone to bed. They had been married almost a year, and in that time they had built something remarkable. The ranch was thriving, the accounts showed steady profit, and they worked together with the kind of understanding that came from genuine partnership. Thomas reached over and took her hand, a rare gesture of physical affection. I want to tell you something, Margaret. When I put up that advertisement, I thought I was looking for someone to help me work the land, to make the isolation bearable. I thought I was looking for a practical arrangement, nothing more. Margaret's heart began to beat faster, but she said nothing, waiting. But you've become more than that. You're not just my partner in work. You're my partner in everything. You've made this house a home. You've made me remember what it feels like to share a life with someone, and I want you to know that He paused, struggling with words that didn't come easily to him. I love you, Margaret. Not because I need you, though I do, but because of who you are. Because you're strong and smart and honest. Because you've never pretended to be anything but yourself. Because when I look at you, I see someone extraordinary. Margaret felt tears streaming down her face, hot and unexpected. For so long she had been the fat girl, the unmarriageable daughter, the object of pity and whispered comments. She had answered his advertisement expecting nothing more than escape, a chance at a different kind of survival. But somewhere along the way, in the daily work of building a life together, something real had grown between them. I love you too, she said, her voice thick with emotion. You gave me back myself, Thomas. You made me see that I was never the problem. The problem was a world too small and too cruel to see what I was worth. He pulled her close, and they sat together in the gathering darkness, two people who had found each other through honesty and need, and had built something neither of them had dared to hope for. The next year brought challenges and triumphs in equal measure. A harsh winter, a difficult calving season, a bout of illness that left Thomas weak for weeks, while Margaret and her father kept the ranch running. But they weathered it all together, the three of them, bound by blood and choice into a family that had nothing to do with what the world thought they should be, and everything to do with what they had built together. 3 years after Margaret left Redemption Springs, she received a letter from her father's old friend, the postmaster. The general store had closed, sold to the mercantile. Sarah Whitmore's husband had been caught embezzling from the bank, and the family had left town in disgrace. The town itself was shrinking, people moving away to seek opportunities elsewhere. Margaret read the letter and felt nothing but a distant pity for the people who had made her feel so small. She was not that person anymore. She was Margaret Brennan, rancher, bookkeeper, partner to a good man and caretaker of land that stretched as far as the eye could see. She was strong and capable and loved. She was exactly who she was meant to be. That evening she stood on the porch with Thomas, watching the sun paint the hills in shades of gold and crimson. In the barn, her father was singing to the cows as he milked them, his voice stronger than it had been in years. Inside the house, a pot roast was cooking slowly, filling the air with the rich smell of home and supper and life being lived. Do you ever regret it? Thomas asked quietly. Leaving everything you knew, coming out here with a stranger. Margaret thought about the woman she had been, standing behind that counter in Redemption Springs, folding burlap sacks while life happened to everyone else. She thought about the advertisement, those life-changing words, age and appearance unimportant. She thought about the courage it had taken to write that letter, to reach for possibility instead of accepting defeat. Not for a single moment, she said, taking his roughened hand in hers. You didn't just give me a different life, Thomas. You gave me back myself. You showed me that what the world said I was worth and what I'm actually worth are two very different things. Out here, I learned that I was never too much or not enough. I was always exactly right, just waiting for the place and person who could see it. Thomas squeezed her hand, and they stood together in the fading light. Two people who had found each other in the most unlikely way and built something extraordinary from the broken pieces of their separate pasts. The land stretched around them, wild and beautiful in theirs, and Margaret felt a contentment so deep it was almost painful. She was no longer the poor fat girl that no one wanted to marry. She was a rancher, a partner, a daughter, and a wife. She was strong and capable and loved. She was home. And in the end, that was all that mattered. Not what the world said she should be, but what she had become. Not the life others thought she deserved, but the life she had built with her own two hands, her practical mind, and her brave heart. The sun set over the hill country, painting the sky in colors that had no names, and Margaret Brennan smiled, knowing that tomorrow would bring more hard work, more challenges, more of this beautiful, difficult, extraordinary life she had chosen, and she wouldn't trade it for anything in the world.